Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. They are Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen. We have ongoing coverage of Penn State hockey, Penn State wrestling over at Lions 24/7. Right now, the postseason continues for those winter sports wrestling program. 8 players into the quarterfinals as we record here on a Friday morning, well on their way toward extending that dynasty. You've got the Frozen Four for women's hockey right here in Happy Valley, and among those 4 are the Nittany Lions, and Daniel Gallen has done a fantastic job covering that women's hockey journey. He has some stuff up over at lions247.com. He'll be providing coverage. And then Mark Brennan, full disclosure, you may see him duck out before this episode ends because he's going to dive back into wrestling coverage, which gets back underway in just a bit. So, guys, happy we could make some time here on a busy week of coverage for us. We got the pro day just a couple days ago in Haluba Hall. We are just a few days away from getting back on the practice field with the Penn State football program. First practice sessions under Matt Campbell. And we're going to lead off with some pro day commentary. Hopefully you caught our coverage over at lions247.com throughout the week. Tyler Calvaruso came to campus and lent a hand with that. And Mark, you helped put a lot out there, not just the photo gallery with your daughter, Grace Brennan, and commentary over at the board, but more than 5 minutes of video highlights from Drew Aller's workout at the quarterback position, trying to build his draft stock after a less than stellar senior season here at Penn State. Let's start there. What did you see from Drew Aller, and what did you hear from him? Because you were parked out in front of a very busy media scrum with Penn State's 3-year starting quarterback.
Yeah, well, first of all, let's not take this access for granted. As you guys know, it wasn't all that long ago under Joe Paterno and Bill O'Brien that we had to wait outside of Pro Day and beg for scraps from people as they came by. So to be able to attack that thing with 5 people was pretty cool. But yeah, all eyes were on Drew Aller. Going back, the cool thing is I think I shot almost every one of his throws. I may have missed 1 or 2 as I was switching positions because as he started to throw deeper, we had to get a little bit better angle. But I thought he was really sharp overall. Not every ball was perfect. But, you saw the arm strength. You saw him throwing on the run. The other thing, and I give Thomas Frank Carr credit for pointing this out in the interviews, that Drew was actually kind of running the show. And that's the first time that we've seen that. So I don't want to steal that. That was T. Frank actually asked Drew about it. And let's give credit where credit is due, even for our competition. But I think that was a pretty big thing for him to show how he was kind of in charge of the whole thing. One thing that was a little disappointing to me is that I think we saw that, this wasn't the best group of receivers. These guys were out there doing their best, but there were some balls that were dropped, and there were some times where he threw deep balls that I think if you had a faster receiver, they were going to get to it, and it may have looked like an overthrow. So I think overall Drew looked really good. And then afterward, I don't think any of us were surprised at the way he handled himself. I mean, that's kind of who Drew Aller has been. Has he been emotional after losses? Sometimes, sure, but he's always been available. The only time he wasn't available was when he got hurt, and it was a career-ending injury. But I thought he handled all the questions well. Basically said he doesn't care where he's drafted. He just wants to get the opportunity. The thing was winding down, and I was about to ask him, what's it been like being on this roller coaster of, 1 month you could be the first overall pick, and then 6 months later, people are wondering what round you're going to go in. And he proactively, I don't know if it was your question, Tyler, I forget who asked it, but he proactively was like, yeah, I just need to get there and show what I can do. So I thought he handled himself really well. And to me, he was the big winner out of that thing. We'll see what happens come draft day. I mean, because there's so many things in play, but I thought he looked really good. And I think, would I have loved to see him do some running and whatnot? Sure. And he said he thought he could have done that, but is that going to really impact where he's drafted? No, I think everybody knows what he's about physically and what his limitations and what his strengths are.
He's about 5 months removed from that broken ankle and a loss to Northwestern, ended his college football career prematurely. And with Drew Aller, I think we all noted that he was looking pretty svelte. I mean, he was about as thin and trim as we've seen him going back to his high school career. I know he checked in about 232. It was a very good 232 on his 6'5" frame. And with Aller, I think one thing that he did note in terms of his injury recovery timeline, remember, there was a question whether he'd even be able to throw the ball at pro day or throw the ball in the NFL combine setting. He did both of those things. And he told reporters that if he had a game to play right now, he could go do that. And so that bodes well for when he does get on an NFL roster, having a chance to have that rookie mini camp experience, get on the field in front of his new coaches. And I know a lot of us have discussed and kind of hammered home the point that if he can find the right fit, a strong organization that has an established starting quarterback that he can kind of work as a protege behind, that would be ideal. Now, every quarterback would love to have that kind of a fit, I'd say, especially when you're not considered someone who's going to be a top 10 pick and you're showing up on that NFL campus as the prohibitive favorite to start a game. Daniel, you wrote a story for us over at Lions247.com regarding Aller and his growth and kind of where he is mentally. Share what you'd like here on the podcast, and we'll turn the page to some other Penn State NFL draft prospects.
Definitely. The way I framed it in the headline is that he's healthy and he's ready. He said that he felt that if there'd been a game 2 weeks ago, he could have been out there. I think when you watched him throw, you didn't really see any ill effects of anything that might have been wrong health-wise. And, he just really did sound like someone that is ready for this next chapter. I think that for him, so much of these past couple months haven't necessarily been about ball. And as soon as he gets drafted, as soon as he gets, into that NFL infrastructure, into that locker room, learning a new scheme, all of that stuff, it can finally really be about ball again. It doesn't have to be about, all the different innuendos about, where is he going to go? What kind of prospect is he? What does he have at stake? What does he doesn't have at stake? It can finally be, okay, he's ready to play. He's ready to go. So I did think that overall it was a pretty classic Drew Aller showing. I think we saw what we expected to from him. And I think it was a good sort of last impression from him. You think back to, I think the first time we saw him on campus was February 2022 at a Thon event. So we're now then 4 years later. And I think that, he handled himself well. We got to see him grow up a little bit. And he does seem like someone who is very, very ready for this next stage of his life and his football career.
Yeah, not exactly the exit interview we thought we might have with Drew Aller when he got to campus as the #1 quarterback in the country. We thought maybe this was going to be must-see TV type of pro day and maybe a guy who's competing to be a top overall pick potentially. Not going to work out that way, but we've had some people say, hey, keep an eye at the end of that first round even for Drew Aller. You never know what could happen toward the end. Teams get QB hungry, they make a move. It seems more like a day 2 situation for Drew Aller, and kind of in that top 5 conversation at quarterback. Indiana's Fernando Mendoza has led the way. It seems Alabama's Ty Simpson has been the consensus number 2, and then depending on who you're looking at for draft analysis, you see Drew Aller, Carson Beck from Miami, Garrett Nussmeier from LSU among the next guys on that rung of the ladder. At running back, Drew Aller was able to lean on a couple standouts throughout his college career. Nick Singleton finished his Penn State career as the all-time touchdowns leader, all-time leader in total all-purpose yards for Penn State. You had Kaytron Allen rush for more than any yards than any Nittany Lion in history, and both those players were in Haluba Hall. 2 different degrees. They were participants. In Nick Singleton's case, he was a participant in bench press. He did 25 reps at 225 pounds. That would have been the number 2 mark out among running backs at the combine. He was out at the combine, but strictly was conducting interviews out there and meeting with teams, was not doing any physical testing. Remember, he suffered a broken foot during preparation for the Senior Bowl down in Alabama in late January. He told us that he's been walking a bunch the last couple of weeks. He didn't seem to be walking with any issues when we were around him on the field on the sideline on Wednesday. And he said he hopes within a week or so of the draft, he'll be able to be running at full speed, be back at 100%, might be able to send out some film of some sprints to different coaches in the NFL who aren't able to witness that in some of the pre-draft interviews and such. New York Jets are a team that he's going to be visiting soon. But it was good to hear that he's on the right track. He wants to prove that he's complete back. And then Kaytron Allen, on the other hand, was not dinged up. He's had a fully healthy pre-draft process, and he's really avoided the testing. I thought he had a good answer. You were part of that scrum, Daniel. It was like, well, what would your 40th time perhaps been? He said, I would have run fast. And I think that's been the question with Kaytron Allen is, would his 40 time help him or hurt him and in this kind of a setting? We know Nick Singleton would have been a great boost. He's in that 4.3 range 40-yard dash going back to high school and some recorded times here at Penn State. But with each of these players, Mark, it's been a kind of a varied opinion on where they will land. I think, again, you're looking at a day 2 consensus for these guys, but also maybe getting into day 3 because of the nature of the running back position, where maybe only one guy goes in the top 50 or so picks in this draft. What did you make of what you saw from Katron? He was largely being utilized as a receiver for Drew Aller during some of his workout drills. And then Nick Singleton, kind of the progress report from him, a guy that, again, when we look back this time last year, much like Drew Aller, we thought it'd be a very different conversation about his pro football outlook.
Yeah, I mean, I get Katron has put a lot on tape and people kind of know what he's all about. But I kind of question him not testing at all, because I think that's the sort of thing that could be a differentiator when it comes to you and maybe another back. So let's see. I mean, he made the call and it's his future. So hopefully it works out well. We could be fans now and, hope nothing but the best for him. I know that when he gets on an NFL roster, he's going to be a good back. So that's the bottom line. What I'm concerned about is he going to cost himself some money by not going a little bit higher? But, that brings me to Parker Washington. Like, remember when he was banged up and when I'm getting to Singleton, it's like we were wondering, and when we did our mock, I would have to go back and look. I think all of us thought Parker was going to go much later because he was banged up and wasn't able to do a lot of stuff. And in the end, do you guys remember where he went? He went higher than I imagined.
He was 6th round.
Was he? Okay.
Yeah.
I thought he might drop out because he didn't do anything. And now he's ended up having a really nice career. So I think that's kind of the lesson is for Nick, wherever he goes, again, as Drew Aller said, it doesn't really matter. Just get into a camp and do what you need to do. I just hope he's able to run sooner rather than later. It was disappointing because he would have been fun to watch at the combine. And I don't know if he even would have tested at Pro Day, because I'm guessing he would have put up really big numbers. But with Nick, I think it's more about the consistency issue on the field. What are you going to get game in and game out? And he kind of needs to be, I think, in not a specific system, but something where he's able to get in space and they're able to use him as a receiver. They're able to do other things. I don't view him as being a workhorse back to the next level. And that's not a knock on him. It's just, I don't think that's what he is. I think he could be a great change of pace guy, a guy who could really hurt teams in the passing game. And, he has a really nice future in the NFL, but I'm just not sure where he's going to get drafted because of that injury.
It feels like his introduction to the league is more of a 6 to 8, maybe 10 touches in a game in different ways. And he put up some very strong receiving film as a junior. The offense didn't operate the same way. He wasn't as much of a piece of the puzzle in the pass attack as a senior, but it's out there on the film. And look, his 4.35 that was documented here at Penn State by the staff in the winter of 2024, if you had applied that and that sustained at the pro days, or at the combine setting, that would have been the second fastest 40-yard dash among all running backs. I already mentioned that his bench press would have been the second best display of strength. We knew he would be a combine standout. Now, certainly would like to come off a more productive year. And then on the flip side, Daniel, the guy that you spent a lot of time with was Katron Allen. I had a story. Fortunately, you provided the audio for me, put a story up at Lions 24/7 on Thursday. And he has all this proof to film, especially his senior season, how hot he got getting those bell cow reps down the stretch in November, how the team performed when that happened. 160 plus rushing yards in each of his final 3 Big Ten contests. Again, the rushing king here at Penn State. And he made a good point, though. He feels like he probably doesn't get the praise / respect that is warranted from what he accomplished and the progress that he made at Penn State. And I don't really get the sense that he's talking about the Penn State football community or the people who cover Penn State. I think he's maybe talking about more of a national scope, people who are talking about the running back class here in the draft. And like Mark said, would it help if he had gone out and ran a 4.5 flat? Yeah, but I don't know if he's going to run a 4.5 flat. And I don't know if what he's going to run is going to actually ding him or not. He said his speed training has been important to him. He's working on that in South Florida along with some receiving skills. But the long story short is this is going to be very much the same dude at an NFL roster. Big chip on the shoulder, going to run violently. And if he can stay healthy, I really like his chances to extend his career in an NFL backfield for years to come.
Katron Allen not testing at Pro Day sort of reminds me of when I was in college and I was doing an internship class where part of it was I'd come back from my internship and meet with an advisor, and we'd go over different things. And the day we were looking over my resume, she looked at my GPA and she was like, like, I don't think you need to put that on there anymore. She's like, it's not bad, but someone else is going to have a better one. And
as I always say when I talk to a college class as a guest, I've never been asked my GPA in an interview setting, and I hope I never am. I never
am. and so I think you look at Kaytron Allen's resume, and I think that it's a thing where I think the film really speaks for itself. And you can watch the film and like you can see him get run down by different guys in different situations. You can see him run away from different guys in different situations. And so I think if you do test, that puts you in a little bit of a box. If certain things happen. But I mean, would have been nice for us to finally have the number because the data, every little bit helps when, evaluating and learning about these players. But yeah, I think that it was interesting to hear Kaytron Allen talk. He's another one of these guys that we really saw grow up over the past 4 years, especially in his interactions with us. And he's much more at ease now than he was as a sophomore when he, was first made available to the media. And, he just seems very sure of himself. It was interesting to hear him talk about, what this means for his family. I think it'd been reported elsewhere, but I think a couple of his family members died during the fall. And so, he mentioned that and, moving forward, with kind of that drive, that motivation. There's a video of him at the combine, seeing his mom after he tested and, emotional scene there. And he talks about what his mom meant to her or meant to him. So it was just, I think, a good conversation because I think Allen is just one of these guys where, at this point in our dealings with him, it's just like, as a player, you knew what you were going to get. And then as a person, with our interactions, you knew what you were going to get with him. And that continued through the pro day. So I'm excited to see where he ends up. It is interesting because like his vision and his ability to find holes, pick his way through things really is second to none. But you do wonder about that athleticism, that speed, those sorts of things. And I think he's a really, really interesting test case for the NFL over these next couple of weeks.
The headliner of this draft class is Venga Ioane, projected as a first-round pick, really the only anticipated round one guy. Like I said, maybe there's a surprise late. Someone really wants a quarterback. They really want Drew Aller. Keep an eye on that. But when it comes to Ioane, he did his business in the combine. He did it again on Wednesday in Haluba Hall. We've got multiple analysts out there comparing him to Quentin Nelson, who was the number 6 overall draft pick in his class out of Notre Dame, a former All-American, perennial All-Pro, well on his way toward an NFL Hall of Fame type resume at the guard position for the Indianapolis Colts. And so Ioane seems like a slam dunk there. I think there's some other guys that we saw working to build their case. Zakee Wheatley is one that comes to mind in the safety spot. I thought he looked really fluid in drills. Ran a low 4.6 in the 40-yard dash. The shuttle number was quite good. He's got the leaping ability. We know he's an outstanding athlete and a guy who had a lot of takeaways during his career. I think Trevor Pena, out of anyone out there who was running routes for Drew Aller, I think he maybe helped his case the most. We didn't get to see him go vertical. We didn't get to see this pass game go vertical much for the 2025 season, but he has that in his arsenal. And he's like someone that, as the pass game got going and as Ethan Grunkemeyer was able to see an expanded playbook downfield, Pena started stacking some significant performances in the Big Ten. Then he was the MVP of the Pinstripe Bowl, and he ran in the 4.4 range for the 40-yard dash. So I'm curious, or was it a 4.52? I think it was the low 4.5, 4.4 range. I don't have it in front of me, but I think that's a good number for him. And so I'm curious if he's a guy that really appeals to a team that wants him in the slot, sees a role for him at punt returner perhaps. And Mark, any of those guys, any others you want to bring up before we shift gears and talk about spring practice? Daniel, I'll give you another opportunity too after Mark.
Yeah, I think Denai Dennis Sutton.
Yes.
Obviously he did really well to combine 4.63 at 6'6", 261 is pretty crazy. I mean, it's not Odafe Owe crazy, but it's pretty crazy. And then kind of the way I get the sense in talking to him that scouts looked at how he kind of handled himself when things went south for Penn State football, and his game kind of elevated as things fell apart, which is kind of an odd way of looking at it. and he talked about how important it was for him to step up as a leader and then to play in a bowl game. I mean, we talked about this 100 times, right? That, when he said he was playing, we thought, okay, he's going to be in there for 3 snaps and that's going to be it. And then here he is out there for, nearly the entire game. So I think he has really helped himself through this process as much as anybody. And then Drew Shelton tested really well. It's hard for me to judge how offensive linemen look going through drills. I'm just not that talented at doing it. So I think his numbers are pretty good. He's going to get a shot somewhere. I think he'll be a later round draft pick and have a chance to do some things for himself in a camp once he gets there, because we know he's very technically sound, can play. Not that he did it here, but I think he has the ability to play multiple positions on the offensive line. And we've seen in the past how key that is on NFL rosters when they only carry 7 or 8 active linemen, that you have a guy who can go in there and play just about anywhere.
Thanks for bringing up Nittany. That was the bad miss on my end to not bring him up myself, because he's a guy that I think was as candid with us in media settings down the stretch last year as we could have possibly hoped. The most candid guy on that roster when we got the chance to interview.
Tyler, can I throw out one line when he said, how many times have you been asked what went wrong or something like that? And or have you heard that a lot? How did he phrase it, Daniel? You're better remembering these things exactly.
It was he was asked to reflect on if he's reflected on the season, and he said well, of course I've been reflecting on it. Everyone's asking me about it
a lot.
Yeah. And he's a physical specimen. We know that. He looks trim. Really curious. I feel like if he's a guy that you can get mid to late in round 2, which is kind of where you see some of that projection, I think that's a really good bargain for an NFL roster carrying forward, because I think he offers some versatility. I think he's built for professional football. I think this has long been ingrained in him. Daniel has a story.
And he was sitting there talking to an Eagles guy for about 15 minutes as we were waiting. Just a little inside scoop there for Eagles fans. I know there are a lot of them who also cover Penn State, but we were waiting to interview him, and this Eagles guy, they were bending each other's ears. So just a little inside scoop as the draft approaches.
Daniel, anything else to offer up on Pro Day? And while we're on the subject, you also had a story pop up at Lions247.com Friday morning regarding the strange nature of these guys returning to familiar campus, familiar facilities, but under different leadership.
Yeah, real quick, one last thing from Pro Day interviews. Talking to Zane Durant, he's someone I always enjoyed interacting with, and he was so loose. Someone asked him about kind of like you said, Tyler, like the weirdness of being back, and how different does it feel or whatever. And the first thing, very classic Zane Durant fashion, Florida guy, he goes, "Oh, it's too cold. Like, I wasn't ready for this weather when I came back." And, still after being here for 4 years, I think last year we talked to him, and after a spring practice where it was maybe like 45 degrees out, and he was in the big puffer in Haluba Hall talking to us. So that was pretty funny and kind of like a classic Durant thing. And he also said that, he's done testing, he's done the workouts, and he was really looking forward to eating some sweets again. Now, I think he said he was going to get some donuts now that he was finally through this process. So that was a little bit of levity that this is something that is so serious and such a big deal, but at the same time these are still guys in their early 20s and who want to have fun, want some levity in their lives as they're going through these big changes. As for the story I have up on Lions 24/7, surveying different guys about what feels different, what's it like to be back. I mean, the words that came up the most was weird and different. Drew Shelton, I asked him about it, and he's like, yeah, it's weird. Let's just call it what it is. I think Alonzo Ford, he said that he'd be lying if he said that it wasn't weird to be back with all these things that were different. But the one thing that a lot of these guys circled back to is that I think there are 2 themes. Denai Dennis-Sutton and Nick Dawkins, they both said we're Penn Staters forever. Denai said, doesn't matter who the coach is. Like, I want to come back. I want to be involved. I want to be around here. And Dawkins expressed something, pretty similar. And then, something else that, also came up was that, the guys that people are talking to are really excited about what's going on. I think Nolan Rucci said that, he specifically brought up the strength program. So I assume that he's talking to the young linemen who are still around. Those guys, it sounds like there's a lot of excitement from the people he's been talking to about the offseason work that they've been getting in and getting bigger, stronger, faster. So I thought that was a little bit of interesting insight. But yeah, I mean, it's, the buildings are all still the same, but, inside you got a lot of different faces, a lot of different names. The signage on the walls is different. I think Audrey Snyder pointed out that, out on the outside of Lash along the practice fields, like there's no big 1-0 anymore. They don't have the core values out there anymore. I think we saw a photo from the inside of the auditorium, different signage on the side, different themes. So, it's different. And, I do think that when Matt Campbell, at his intro presser, and then when we talked to him again in February, and he talked about making connections with the alumni and those who have come before, I know a lot of people's minds probably went to guys from the 94 team, guys from the 80s, guys from the 70s. And we know that there's been outreach, pretty far back. But I think it's probably pretty easy to forget or overlook, building a connection with these guys who, have just left. And it really does seem like that Campbell made a really good impression on them. I mean, I think, Drew Aller, he's not going to play here anymore, but I think his voice still carries some weight, especially given that he and James Franklin were tied at the hip. And he said that, Campbell is someone that he had a lot of respect for. He said Iowa State was one of his top schools coming out. And so, I think that having that kind of endorsement, it wasn't really tepid or anything. It was, I thought, pretty strong. I think that means something. And you talk about some of the guys that we saw there, like Olu Fashanu was there. Caden Saunders was there. He's going to play at Southern Miss.
Yeah.
I think Grace spotted Javen Williams there. He's not he left. Kobe King was back.
Sean Clifford, his brother was there, but Sean Clifford in the house too. Yep.
Yeah. And so I think that to see some of guys who have transferred out, to see them back, see them around, I thought that was pretty interesting. And I think it speaks to, how Campbell is doing things and, how he's working, to reshape the program and build some connections.
Plenty more pro day coverage from this week over at Lions247.com. We have several profiles on a lot of these NFL draft prospects, full results. As I said, 5 minutes of video highlights from Drew Aller's session from Mark Brennan. But let's turn the page now and get into spring practices, which begin next week. We anticipate an opportunity to hear from Matt Campbell early in the week. We'll bring you the latest from that press conference on our next podcast episode. But Mark, I know we're going to see you drop out of this show in just a bit as wrestling starts again. So let's lead off with you. We've heard so much about the cultural development over the course of the winter. The reality is there's 50 new guys on this roster. They've got to get a feel for each other. They got to get a feel for this staff, and they're all making their debut in one fell swoop to begin next week. What does your curiosity land the most regarding how things are going to move forward for a new era of the Nittany Lions now that they make this transition to practices?
Yeah, just chemistry. I mean, it's one thing to have chemistry in the off season and when you're going through workouts and whatnot, but spring practice is still the off season, but it's kind of a little different version of it. So, how do these things work when you get on the field? I don't think I'm violating any confidences in saying we're going to have access to a practice next week, and I think a significant amount of that practice. So that's what I'm going to be looking for. How do they go through from drill to drill, and what's the communication like? And there were certain ways things were done under Franklin, and how is it going to be done under Matt Campbell? One of the cool things is we're going to have an extended look at practice, from what I understand. That was not the case under Franklin. We were typically getting smaller kind of chunks even in the spring. So I'm anxious to see just how all of those kind of, not intangibles, but you're bringing in all these new players, and you have all these players that are coming back, and you have different coaches from different places. How does Campbell bring all of that together? And I think we're going to get a sense of that when we're seeing them out on the field for an extended period of time.
I'm pretty sure in this decade that we saw maybe 2 extended 11-on-11 practice looks under James Franklin over the last 5 seasons, 6 seasons. And so maybe that changes a bit. It sure would be helpful for our angle with all these new players on the field. And Mark, again, I'm going to stay with you here so you can chime in a bit before you go. position competitions are all across the field. Some of these positions are completely reset. They've got a real Iowa State feel to them. Others are more familiar to us, and they're players that significantly saw action in 2025. Where are a couple, before you say goodbye to us, that you really want to focus in on when we get on the practice field?
Yeah, I'll go back to what I was just saying. The offensive line to me is going to be like a microcosm of the entire team, right? Because you have this new beer chugging coach who, just seems like, a typical offensive line type guy. And you have really good players coming back in Donko and Cousins, and I'm sure I'm missing people. And then you have guys coming in from Iowa State and all over creation and, Texas State and, you name it. So how is that all going to come together? We know that the offensive line, that the working in unison is such a huge part of what they do. So I think it's going to be just absolutely gigantic for them. And then we could bounce over the whole team, but they really need, especially after juggling coaches, the wide receiver position, they need some stability there. And that needs to start now. And they need people to step up and become leaders. Who are going to be the players who do that? Is it going to be guys from other schools? Is it going to be guys who are returning? But to me, I think they're going to be fine at quarterback. Once Rocco Becht is okay. Tight end, I think we're all pretty excited about what they have coming back. Again, guys we expect to be back from injury who may not play a lot in the spring. Running back, I think Penn State's always going to be in good shape at running back. So those two positions, offensive line and wide receiver, are key to me. And then over on the other side of the ball, Denai was talking about it, how he thinks they're going to be fine at defensive end, but a lot of new faces. And, who's going to step up? I think there's enough talent there to get it done, but who are going to be the people who kind of elevate, given everybody that they lost from last season?
Yeah, good stuff, Mark. We'll let you get back to it as the wrestling squad looks to chase down another national championship. Coverage from Mark on that wrestling tournament, NCAA, over at Lions247.com into the weekend. Appreciate you. We'll see you in person soon.
Thanks, guys.
All right, we'll continue with Daniel now on the subject of spring practice as we say goodbye to Mark. And Daniel, I think Mark did a nice job of kind of teeing us up for a variety of spots there on the offensive line. We'll remind that one of the players he mentioned, and he reported on this, he was the one who broke the news, Anthony Donko, going to be sidelined this spring with a cleanup type injury coming off of last season, expected to be full go when the team gets back on the field for August preseason camp. And that goes for a few players that we've discussed here on the podcast. Rocco Becht, that quarterback, maybe we see some of him in some capacity this spring as he comes off of surgery, but they're not going to push him to any kind of limits. We're not going to see Tony Rojas in all likelihood at linebacker, who's going to be a projected starter for Penn State this year as a redshirt junior. The tight end group is going to be down a couple players, and Andrew Rappleyea and Gabe Burkle, who are both recovering from injuries now. But there's a lot of areas to look where players are going to be certainly active, and some of them will be new to us. Some of them will be seeing, are they ready to take the next step? Where do you want to start our conversation here?
Yeah, I think like Mark said, your mind goes to offensive line first, because that's a spot where you have, both returners and newcomers. A lot of these rooms, it's sort of one or the other when you look around. But from there, I think to go to the other side of the ball, I think that how the secondary shakes out is going to be really interesting. Terry Smith kept the most of that, if not all of that cornerback room, in the fold, and then the entire safety room left, except for Vabu Torre, and a ton of Iowa State safeties came over. So I think that that's where you have two position groups that, are very involved with each other, and you've got a lot of different, names and new faces. And I remember hearing, a little bit with the Jim Knowles defense, and also a little bit with the Manny Diaz defense, where you got to have that communication across the back end, from the corners to the safeties to the nickel, to the outside guys. And I think that that's something that you're going to have to develop this offseason and really hone in on a little bit. There's a ton of talent there. Marcus Neal, who came over from Iowa State, really, really good. Jeremiah Cooper coming back from an injury. He's a former All Big 12 performer. You think about Darius Dixon, Aldavian Collins, on the outside, Zion Tracy with a ton of experience at the nickel. I think that could be a really, really fun group. And we'll see maybe how they get tested by some of these new wide receivers who are in the fold.
Yeah, I've said this before, and I'll kind of double down on it now. And I think if there's one of those Iowa State pickups who has the best chance to earn All-American status, maybe first team All Big Ten status, I would put my money down on Marcus Neal Jr. at the safety position. You're going to see him all over the football field. You may see him in kind of a hybrid role in the box, depending on what they want to do under Danton Lynn with this defensive coordinator. Obviously, it's a different defensive coordinator than what they had at Iowa State, but he's so versatile, and they already thought he might have been the best Big 12 defender last year. Now he gets a chance to continue with his safeties coach, Dion Broomfield. And you mentioned Jeremiah Cooper, a guy who we could see again at different spots on the field. Versatility is there. He's going to be playing safety, but he's someone you forget a little bit about because of that injury, but a really strong track record, as you referenced, with Iowa State. I think, to me, the linebacker spot, especially when you talk about Tony Rojas not being available for these next few weeks for Penn State, we're going to see a lot of former Cyclones involved. Caleb Bacon is someone who we've heard a ton about his ability to get after the quarterback. This is a team that's going to need to find maybe some creative ways to do that because they don't have a lot of those established edge rusher types at this stage. We'll see how much they come along under new edge rusher coach Christian Smith in the months ahead. But to me, Caleb Bacon could be kind of a chess piece for this defense as they try to disrupt the passing pocket in some different ways. He's got a history there. Really great bend from him. And Kale Brazina, he is a guy who played the least amount of defensive snaps of the three linebackers they brought over from Iowa State. But he had experience calling the defense with the green dot on his helmet as a true freshman. He is somebody that sitting next to him at a table at Beaver Stadium a few weeks ago was about as physically impressive from a muscular standpoint as any linebacker I've been around here at Penn State. We've been around some good ones as well. And so I think you start to put some of that stuff together and factor in will we see any of Alex Tash? That's a question. Maybe we don't get a chance to really fully evaluate him again until fall camp because of the injury he suffered last year during bowl preparation. But what did we hear from Matt Campbell about Tash just about a month ago? He could be an all-time great at linebacker U, and people don't throw those kind of phrases around, I don't think. And I don't think Matt Campbell's the kind of guy to do that as well. And so you work your way through things. And Cooper Ebel, I probably mentioned him too late. He's a guy who was tied with Neal for the team lead in sacks last year for Iowa State. He has played that Mike position. So I think if we're going to see three linebackers on the field with more regularity than what we have seen in the past, that's something that'll probably be translated into our looks on the practice field. Are we going to get more of those looks, or is it a fifth defensive back creeping up alongside those linebackers? Very curious about that. And I think defensive tackle, Daniel, we're going to need the roster handy at that spot. Not only did they have a complete reset in a lot of ways there, Ty Blanding's still around. He's a familiar face for us. Liam Andrews, a former top 100 overall recruit, is here. He's in his third year. So a couple guys that we are familiar with, but a lot of guys they brought in who are 320 plus pounds, coming in from UCLA, coming in from Utah, different programs. I know Tyler Calvaruso is very high on Keanu Williams, who comes in with familiarity with the defensive line coach Malloy from their time together, and Danton Lynn from their time together at UCLA. But Dallas Vakahali comes in from Utah. A lot of people are high on what he can do. We've gotten some looks at Armstrong Nodum. Wow. We talked about him as being a first guy off the bus type of dude. Sayale Tupaki, if there's ever a college football veteran, he is certainly one of them. And so to me, this is going to be a reshaped defensive front, and those defensive tackles have the ability to be kind of a rotational battering rams. And I'm curious who trots out there first and second. And that's assuming that by the end of spring ball, we get some kind of semblance of what the first, second teams might look like.
Yeah, I think that you threw a ton of names out there, and that's really what the deal is right now. There's all these different guys who have occupied different roles in different defenses, and you need this spring to really mesh that together to figure out what they can do. I do think that the defensive line, how different it looks, will be really interesting just from the eye test. We're used to guys who looked a certain way, moved a certain way, played a certain way, and not really any of those guys are still around anymore. So it's going to be interesting fitting those puzzle pieces together. I'm probably gonna have to ask Mark to print off like 4 different copies of the roster for me, because I'll probably be marking them up and trying to make notes here and there about every different guy. But it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think in the thing about the Big Ten is that it still has the stereotype as win in the trenches, ground and pound. How can you win in November in East Lansing? How can you win in November in Iowa City? And I think that starts, up front, especially on the defensive side of the ball. So let's see what these big guys can do.
I'm starting to come around on the defensive end group. It was a group that maybe back in January, I'm trying to put the puzzle together, and you're a little bit nervous about what that might be. I still think they're going to have to come up with some creative ways of getting safeties and linebackers involved in some blitz packages and disrupting the quarterback that way. I have no doubt they'll be able to accomplish some of that over the next several months before this season kicks off. But what can you generate from a 4-man front when you're not involved in the linebackers, when you're not dedicating a defensive back to blitzing? And that's going to come down to a lot of what these defensive ends can accomplish in their one-on-one battles against offensive tackles. And Ivan Kamaju, Max Granville, some homegrown talent there. Ike Eziago is someone that we talked about with Tyler Calvaruso a couple weeks ago on the podcast, who's shred his body a little bit, down about 10 pounds from last year and at 275. He's a big body defensive end. We thought Nittany Sutton was big body. This guy takes that to a different level, but he doesn't really have the resume of being a disruptive presence, a guy who's going to rack up a bunch of sacks on a season. Can he become more of that type of player here? And then Alexander McPherson is more of that long, wiry type defensive end that we've gotten long looks at with the Nittany Lions, and guys have had success with that kind of a physical frame here in the past. I think he's still coming together physically, but he got significant work last year as a freshman, certainly got his feet wet in the Big 12 conference as with the Colorado Buffaloes out there. Now he comes to town. And so there's 4 guys to work there. And the one guy moved past pretty fast, who I think I'm going to be focused in on at ASAP when we get on the field, will be Max Granville. Because to me, and I think you feel the same way, if he is all systems go and he's reverted back to the kind of player we thought he could become here at Penn State as early as last year as a redshirt freshman, and he can be that type of a presence, that Chop Robinson 2.0 type of player as a redshirt sophomore, then to me that changes the complexion of what we're talking about on the edge, because he is that type of dude who can zoom past an offensive tackle, get into the face of a quarterback, and even if he doesn't bring the QB down, he's going to necessitate an expedited throw from the pocket.
Yeah, when Nittany Sutton was talking to us Wednesday and he ran through the defensive end group, he talked about Max Granville being that quick, twitchy guy, in the mold of a Chop Robinson or an Abdul Carter. I think if you add that type of presence to your edge group, I think that's a pretty big plus for you. It is a thing where the group in terms of the Penn State players who have stuck around, it skews young and it skews inexperienced. So there's some
Robinson got to mention. I mean,
yeah,
that's a guy that has been listed as out before so many games in his career. He's been plagued by injuries. He's still here, like Nittany Sutton from the McDonough School down in Maryland. Came to campus with some excitement, but we haven't gotten a lot of looks at him. I know Denai had some good things to say about him, though.
Yeah, Dennis Sutton went out of his way to single out Mason Robinson, his McDonough School teammate, and talk about that he's someone that Denai feels can make an impact when he's on the field. It's just been a question of injuries. I still don't think he's made his collegiate debut. And he's been around for a little while at this point, and that was a pretty big recruiting win. I think for Penn State, where to flip him from Northwestern, from out of a high school where they had a pipeline and they were on a pretty nice run of success with high caliber prospects. I think that's the thing where it takes guys different timelines to get to the point where they can be involved, make an impact. So, I think that Mason Robinson is probably someone that, hey, don't forget about him yet. He's still around. He's still here. Maybe things can align for someone like him. I think it really does, start with Max Granville. And, because if he can be, that Chop or Abdul type presence, even if he's only 3/4 of those guys, or maybe 5/8 of those guys, I think that can be really, really big for your defensive line.
Daniel, you and I over the course of this offseason have dedicated a lot of time to talking about the offensive tackle position, so I don't want to rehash a bunch of it, just to bring people up to speed if you haven't been paying attention. Anthony Donko, as I said, going to be sidelined. He's the only guy who has starting experience at tackle for Penn State on this roster. So without him, you'll see guys like Garrett Sexton, Malachi Goodman, Owen Alasine getting a lot of reps here in the tackle position. We'll see what they can do with that. But I'm curious about two guys that we are pretty confident are going to be the starting guards for Penn State. And there's going to be a center competition. We've kind of gone over that quite a bit too, with Brock Riker coming in after getting some All-American freshman accolades at Texas State last season. He makes a big jump. He's been doing a great job putting on necessary weight. I'm really high on what he can do. And Dominic Rulli, a fifth-year senior, is going to challenge him for that center job, replacing Nick Dawkins, who was a 2-year starter. But going back to what I said, they could have two guys bookending whoever that starting center is, could be very special. Trevor Bohr and then Cooper Cousins. Cooper Cousins has always been on our radar. I feel like since he was about a sophomore in high school, as someone who could become the face of this offensive line, perhaps even the face of the franchise type, because of who he is and how he operates. And I know a lot of the players who are leaving the program point to Cooper Cousins when they say who's taking the mantle of leadership, and they say it's that dude. So Cooper Cousins has some experience at this stage. He played a lot in the Pinstripe Bowl, but last year didn't really take off the way we thought he might. Injuries played a role there. And then Trevor Bohr is a guy they were as high as anyone on the Iowa State offensive line last year, and that was reflected by the fact that they made him a priority to follow him from Ames, Iowa. And he's got a chance to really establish himself in the Big Ten trenches, I think, as a formidable presence. And to me, seeing those two guys work in tandem at guard, if they are as they have been billed so far this offseason, that's going to really set the stage for success across the way, because they can reinforce things for you on the interior with, maybe a center coming in and out with Riker and Rulli, with maybe different guys cycling in at the tackle position. Not only are they really impressive physical pieces at the guard spot, but we've heard they're also intelligent, accountable, and really bought into the program pieces. So I think they can be tone setters, especially with Anthony Donko not on the field this spring.
It's a pretty interesting dynamic when you talk about building an offensive line, because usually you talk about having, a cornerstone tackle, whether that's the left side or the right side, and you move from there, or you have that center, where everything radiates out from that guy. So it is pretty interesting to have, I just looked at like Bohr, 6'4", 325, Cooper Cousins, 6'6", 316, just two large bodies that, have different levels of experience, but are regarded to have high ceilings. I think that is something that you can really build off of and build around. I think that you look in the NFL, like guard play is becoming prioritized. That market is catching up. You look at Venga Ioane, someone who is, pretty much a guard exclusive player. We know that he can do a little bit of center, but I think NFL teams are mostly looking at him as a guard. The fact that there's certain mock drafts that have him going in the top half of the first round, I think that shows that you can prioritize that position and have it be somewhere on the line where success can come from there. So yeah, I mean, I do think that Cooper Cousins, I think we've all been waiting for that extended look at him. That is not in mop-up time or not in different packages because you have a sixth offensive lineman out there. I think that it would be nice to get to see him play a full game, without having to rotate, without looking over his shoulder. I think we could really, really learn a lot about him. I think we all know where our expectations are when it comes to that potential situation. But I think both of those guys could be really, really fun to see, especially if we get a look at practice, they're going to be going up against some really, really big bodies like we talked about earlier.
That's a great point. I mean, I hope the bench press numbers have been solid for them this year across the interior, because they have some big fellows across the way when they get into some one-on-one work and 11-on-11 work. It's going to be fun to follow. Hopefully we get a chance to provide you some feedback from those interactions, some video footage, and a lot more at Lions247.com. Of course, the tight ends are going to continue to be a primary factor when you talk about establishing the run beyond the offensive linemen. You're going to see a lot of two tight end sets still with this Iowa State staff coming over. They've had a history of that, just like we have seen here at Penn State over the years. And again, Gabe Burkle not available. He's an established starter type from Iowa State, so expect to see a lot of him come August, but not here in the spring. Same deal for Andrew Rappleyea, a key roster retention piece for this Penn State team, but someone we're not going to be getting eyes on in pads this spring as he's in an injury recovery mode. So Benjamin Bramer feels like you kind of have him figured out. 6'7", big time target. He was, I believe, Rocco Beck's roommate on the road last year. So there should be a lot of chemistry between him and QB1 this year, coming off an all-conference caliber campaign. But we talked about Brian Kordovich a few weeks ago with Tyler Calvaruso, the redshirt freshman, as a young player who should get a lot of work. Cooper Alexander falls into that category as well. Redshirt sophomore coming over from Iowa State, was a backup over there. He should probably get some extended run at that position. So when you talk about some interesting mystery pieces at tight end and then extended over to wide receiver in the passing game, Daniel, who are some guys that you particularly would love to see get a chance to go up and get the ball while we're there, staying on the sideline, that maybe we didn't get a chance to see last year? And I think Brian Kordovich clearly falls into that category for me. Personally, I would love to see Peter Gonzalez because he has been sidelined for so much of his career, now a redshirt sophomore at the wide receiver spot. But when we talk about pass catchers and tight end, wide receiver included, who would you like to see get more run in the spring, get more opportunities to go up and beat a defensive back and help his quarterback out?
I think the start in the tight end room, I agree with you on Kordovich. We know what he looks like just as a person walking around, and I think we know how that could translate to the run game. But it would be interesting to see, how has he rounded out his skill set a little bit more. I do think Cooper Alexander is intriguing too. He's got NFL bloodlines, and when you're bringing over Bramer and Burkle, it can be easy to get caught in that shadow a little bit, of the excitement. And I think that he also fits into the idea that Penn State is trying to build this roster in a sustainable fashion, not just for 2026, but for 27, 28, even 29. And I think that he's someone who factors into the future plans. So what kind of player could he be as you move forward? With the wide receivers, I think Keith Jones Jr., someone that, the Grambling transfer, heard a lot of really good things about him. Noah Pauley, when we talked to him early in February, had some nice things to say. Former basketball player, got to football a little bit late, pretty raw, but has done some nice things on the field, and I think is regarded to have a really, really high ceiling. That could be pretty fun, especially when you consider the reputation that this Iowa State staff has, even with Pauley moving on and bringing in Kashif Moore. It's still the staff with the reputation of developing players, and taking this type of player and helping them reach their potential. So it'll be exciting to see. And then one last name from guys who are returning, Lyric Samuel. He's another person who cuts a figure, 6'4", rail thin. How is he taking to the strength program? How is he continuing to develop? And yeah, like I said, Iowa State has taken some of these really, really big raw wide receivers and developed them into draft picks, developed them into guys who have made plays in the Big 12. And I think that when you talk about the developmental reputation of the staff coming in, I think that Kobe Howard, high ceiling player, but I think he had a level of refinement. Even Peter Gonzalez, I think coming in, he had a level of refinement as well. But I think Lyric Samuel is one of these guys that when you think about this new staff, players who returned from last year's Penn State roster, I think that he could be really one of the big winners as you move forward.
There's been such a problem for Penn State in terms of just one-on-one matchups on the perimeter. Go get the ball, be aggressive, use your physical talents, use your length, go get the ball, help your quarterback out. We just haven't seen a lot of moments like that in recent seasons. And the guys that we're talking about here, Peter Gonzalez, 6'2", 207 pounds, very solidly built. Keith Jones Jr., 6'4", 208 pounds, basketball standout down in New Orleans in high school, jump out the gym type talent, dunking the ball all over the place. That was reflected in what he did at Grambling at a lower level of football, but he would climb the ladder, beat the defensive back. Really impressive highlight film from last season. And then Lyric Samuel, you described him as rail thin. He was pipe cleaner thin when we saw him on a prospect camp field a couple of summers ago. Now he's pushing towards 190 pounds at 6'4". So I feel like they have the body types and guys that should be very hungry this spring to go out and assert themselves because jobs are there for the taking. You got Brett Eskelson coming in, a downfield threat, racked up a ton of yards after the catch last year. I think he was one of the Big 12 leaders in yards per catch period, close to 20, in fact. And then Chase Sowell, who's done it at a few different levels of football, East Carolina, then Iowa State. Drops were a bit of an issue for him at times last year, but those two have a lot of familiarity with the starting quarterback this year and Rocco Becht. I think you mentioned coming out of our last availability with players that those two veteran receivers, maybe they're limited at times in spring ball as they had some things cleaned up. We'll find out that pretty soon, hopefully. But just an open door right now. And yes, of course, Kobe Howard, as much as we heard good things about him, I mean, Marcus Higgins was banging that drum in early August about what he was accomplishing on the practice field, yet it took the head coach getting fired for us to see him get onto the game field. And so I'd love to see what Kobe Howard looks like as kind of an alpha component of this pass attack on the field. And let's finish with the backfield for this conversation, Daniel, because we've mentioned it a couple of times. How much will we see of Rocco Becht remains undetermined. Hearing from him, hearing from quarterbacks coach Jake Waters indicates that he will be on the field throwing passes in some capacity during spring ball. Maybe that doesn't happen until April. Does it happen in an 11-on-11 contact type setting, or is it more of a 7-on-7 deal? To me, that leaves a lot of questions on who can develop behind him. And can Alex Mansky, over the course of the next 10 months, establish himself as the quarterback of the future, as the legitimate heir apparent to Rocco Becht? We know they brought in competition in the form of Connor Berry, a Division III All-American, a guy who's a fifth-year senior, down to his final year of eligibility. Mansky has 4 years of eligibility. And I know he wants to do everything in his power, and they believe he has the ability at 6'3", 225, athleticism, arm talent, to go out and prove he can be that guy. But if he doesn't, all of a sudden that maybe opens the door to another transfer quarterback next winter. And so to me, all due respect to Connor Berry, curious to see what it looks like for him making a major leap in his final year. Those couple freshmen they brought in Case Evans and Peyton Falzone. I think Mansky's story is one of the primary storylines here for the entire squad, what he can accomplish this spring. I'll remind people he enrolled in January last year at Iowa State, but he was recovering from an elbow injury. So he wasn't throwing the football around in a practice setting until August last year. This is a key proving ground, I think, for him to really set himself apart among those backup quarterbacks.
Definitely. It's like I mentioned earlier that when Matt Campbell and his staff built this roster during the offseason, they weren't just thinking about a quick turnaround in 2026 and competing right away. The phrase that Matt Campbell used was, I think, layering. The phrase I've used is sustainability in terms of moving this forward and making sure that you don't have to go to the portal for 40 guys every season, and that you do have lines of succession and, it's very clear, okay, where do we have holes? Where are we going to have to prioritize, recruiting, transfer portal, those types of things. And I think if Mansky can, really assert himself there and show what he can do, I think that eliminates a headache or an item on the shopping list, or, potentially even, frees up some money for you when you talk about NIL budget and, trying to bring guys in from the outside. So, I think Mansky is someone that, we're all going to be interested in learning a lot about. I think he's going to get a lot of opportunities to really prove himself and what he's able to do. And I think that he's going to tell us a lot about the future of the position this spring. I know that's kind of a grandiose thing to say when we still have one more year of Rocco Becht to get through and all of that. But how this spring goes, I think that it can probably shape the thinking at that position moving forward. So that'll be a fun storyline. I will say with Barry, he did start his career at App State. So, he is someone with, D1 FBS experience. He's from Northern Virginia, which isn't exactly a slouch when it comes to competition. So, he does have, I think, kind of that pedigree, when making that leap up from D3. But I do think that, you're going to hope that, it's Alex Mansky and that, Connor Berry is in that veteran mentor, maybe, pseudo assistant QBs coach role in there. But it'll be fun to see all these QBs, this spring, because talk about Peyton Falzone, what we saw him get to do at camp. Case Evans was so productive down in high school in Texas. Connor Berry, I think, is definitely an unknown to all of us. So it'll be fun to get to know some different throwers back there.
Outside of Peyton Falzone, this time last year, there's no way in hell you thought any of these other quarterbacks would be at a Penn State spring practice. And the funny thing is, we're watching some film coming out of Blacksburg on Thursday when they're getting rolling with things under James Franklin on the practice field. And, oh, there's Ethan Grunkemeyer. Oh, there's Troy Hune, guys that we thought would read the future here at quarterback.
Even Bryce Baker.
Yeah,
that was a storyline late in that 25 recruiting cycle too.
Yeah, so we're getting used to the scramble, and we certainly see it at running back too, where we're going to close this conversation. We spoke earlier about Pro Day with Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. We know what they accomplished here for 4 years as a tandem, and now we see what happens next. Is it a 1-2 punch with the transfer pickups and James Peoples from Ohio State, Carson Hansen from Iowa State? Does Quentin Martin kind of elbow one of those guys to the side and make his case? Is it a 3-man backfield? What does Cam Wallace do as a redshirt junior, a guy that we thought for a little while there was going to be off into the transfer portal and heading somewhere else? And so there is so much to look at where the staff really should have their head wrapped around who Carson Hansen is. They gave him the ball 25 times a game last year. It's the same coaching staff outside of the running backs coach, which is pretty important in Savon Huggins. James Peoples looking to go from a guy who is a second or third fiddle at Ohio State, somebody who can maybe assert himself as a lead player in a backfield. And as we said, Quentin Martin coming off the best performance by far of his career and the only appearance on offense of 2025 in the Pinstripe Bowl. So, Daniel, let's close with your commentary on what you're looking closest at the running back position when we do get a look next week at practice.
I think you want to see how different does Quentin Martin look in terms of the talk that Matt Campbell had about him putting on weight, transforming his body a little bit. How can he translate what he did in the Pinstripe Bowl forward? What kind of springboard was that for him, in the weight room, in off-season conditioning? And then I think we all want to get a handle on James Peoples. What does he look like? He's another guy where he's got that Ohio State, next to his name, and that's always going to gather attention. We know that he was a similar caliber recruit as Quentin Martin coming out in the class of 2024. So how can he build on that? What does he bring that might be a little bit different? I think that Peoples is someone that you're always going to be excited about getting someone from Ohio State. Like, that's just how it works. They've recruited at that level. They've stockpiled talent. So what can he bring that maybe is a little bit different? And maybe how can he reach a ceiling here? And do things that maybe he wasn't able to do out in Columbus.
Yeah. As referenced, our next episode of this podcast coming your way. I'm pretty sure next Tuesday you'll see that drop. That'll be some fresh commentary from Matt Campbell. We last heard from him in February. Now we'll get to hear from him as this team gets to work on the practice field. We'll bring you the latest in that conversation over here on the podcast. Between now and then, though, encourage you to check out Lions247.com. There's plenty coming out of Pro Day, as we said. Daniel's got a good story up on Denied Dennis Sutton. He's got a story up today on how these guys are feeling out the new staff and the new circumstances after spending their 4 or 5 years with James Franklin. And then, as I mentioned, Daniel's going to be on the women's hockey beat this weekend, Frozen 4 here in Happy Valley. Mark Brennan has you covered with everything happening on the wrestling mat at NCAA's for the Nittany Lions. And we're going to learn by the end of the weekend where the men's hockey program is going to start out their journey for the NCAA tournament. So a lot happening as winners.
They also hired a new women's basketball coach yesterday.
And Daniel had coverage for you there too over at Lions 24/7, wearing a lot of hats beyond the 24/7 Sports one that you see him in right now on YouTube. For Daniel, for Mark, I am Tyler Donahue. Things are really heating up here in Happy Valley. We hope you enjoy the coverage here and on the website. For now, stepping aside, this has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.